Why did the US Army send artists, painters, and fashion designers to fight Hitler? How did a group of men armed with nothing but paint, sound, and imagination manage to fool one of the most powerful armies in history? Which secret unit used inflatable tanks, fake radio messages, and recorded battle sounds to make the Nazis believe in entire divisions that never existed? This is not a movie. This is real history, a classified operation so secret that it remained hidden for almost 50 years. The story of an army that never fired a bullet, yet helped win the war. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. It's always great seeing how far this community reaches. Which part of the Ghost Army's deception amazed you the most? The inflatable tanks, the sound tricks, or the fake radio messages? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to see what impressed you the most about these artists of war. Welcome to the Ghost Army, the artists who fooled Hitler. It was 1944. Europe was burning under the weight of a world at war. The Allies had landed in Normandy, and every mile they gained against Hitler's forces came with a heavy price. But in a small, secret corner of the American war effort, a different kind of unit was forming, one that didn't carry heavy weapons, but sketchbooks, paintbrushes, sound trucks, and a strange sense of humor. They called themselves the Ghost Army. Officially, it was known as the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. It was a top-secret tactical deception unit made up of around 1,100 men, soldiers, artists, sound engineers, stage designers, and radio operators. Their mission wasn't to fight the enemy directly, it was to fool them. The idea came from a simple but revolutionary thought. What if deception could save lives? What if the Germans could be tricked into believing a large American force was in one location, while the real troops attacked somewhere else? This idea had been inspired by British deception operations earlier in the war, particularly those used before the D-Day landings. But the Americans took it to another level. In the spring of 1944, the US Army brought together artists from some of the most famous art schools in America, students from Yale, Pratt Institute, and Cooper Union. Many of them had never fired a gun before. They were painters, architects, fashion designers, and set builders. Some would later become world-renowned, names like Bill Blass, who would go on to design high fashion after the war, and Ellsworth Kelly, who would become one of the great American painters of the 20th century. But before fame, they would fight Hitler with imagination. When they trained, they didn't learn how to storm a beach. They learned how to create an army out of nothing. They used rubber and canvas to build inflatable tanks, jeeps, and artillery, life-size replicas that could fool a German reconnaissance plane flying overhead. They used powerful loudspeakers mounted on trucks to broadcast the sounds of tanks rolling, soldiers shouting, and engines roaring, fake soundscapes so realistic that even nearby Allied units sometimes believed they were hearing a real army. Every movement had to be convincing. Every illusion had to feel authentic. Because if the Germans found out the truth, that these were not real combat troops, but artists pretending to be soldiers, it could be a massacre. To maintain secrecy, even other American units were rarely told who they were. They were referred to simply as special troops, but behind that name was a strange mixture of theater and war, art and survival. Their first assignments were small-scale, like rehearsals for something bigger. In France, after D-Day, the Ghost Army began performing their first acts of deception, setting up fake camps, moving rubber tanks at night, and transmitting false radio messages to simulate an entire division. They would drive their trucks in circles to create the illusion of a massive convoy. They would plant dummy artillery guns and fake supply dumps. Even the campfires and the laundry lines were carefully staged. Everything was planned to trick the enemy into thinking an entire American force was present, when in truth, it was only a handful of creative minds with an extraordinary mission. What made it work wasn't just the equipment, it was the acting. These men became soldiers, engineers, even generals when needed. They studied the way real troops behaved, how officers walked, how commands were shouted, and how vehicles were parked. Then they imitated it all perfectly. At times, they were only miles away from the German front lines. If caught, they would have no defense, only inflatable tanks and recordings. But somehow, their illusions worked. German scouts reported seeing entire divisions where none existed. Their false movements pulled Nazi forces away from real attack zones. And every time they succeeded, they saved thousands of lives. No bullets, no bombs, just art, sound, and deception. This was warfare as performance, a theater of survival. And in that strange battlefield of imagination, The Ghost Army was about to become one of the most unique units in military history. War has always been about strength tanks, guns, and strategy. But the Ghost Army proved that imagination could be just as deadly. By mid-1944, the unit had perfected the art of deception. They could make an entire army appear or disappear within hours, and they did it using nothing more than air, paint, sound, and words. Their tools were simple but ingenious. The first weapon, inflatable tanks. Made from rubberized fabric, these life-size tanks could be inflated in minutes using air compressors. When viewed from the air or from a distance, they looked perfectly real, casting shadows, gleaming under sunlight, even showing fake treads on the ground. German reconnaissance planes would photograph them and report large armored divisions assembling, completely unaware that they were looking at balloons. The second weapon, sound. The U.S. Army worked with engineers from Bell Labs to record the sounds of real tanks, trucks, and artillery. These recordings were carefully edited to create specific soundtracks, one for a tank division moving, another for a camp preparing for battle, another for artillery firing. Mounted on massive speakers attached to trucks, these sounds could be projected up to 15 miles away. At night, the Ghost Army would roll their sound trucks into position, inflate their fake tanks, and play the recorded noises through the forests and fields. From miles away, German soldiers would hear engines, commands, and the metallic clatter of weapons, the unmistakable signs of an advancing army. But if they came closer, there was nothing there, only the soft hum of air pumps and a few men laughing quietly in the dark. Their third weapon was radio deception. Real armies constantly transmitted coded messages to coordinate movements. The Ghost Army learned to mimic these transmissions perfectly. They studied the rhythm and habits of real radio operators, how long they transmitted, the pauses they used, even the way they tapped out Morse code. Each operator developed a signature style, and the Ghost Army replicated those signatures to make it seem like actual divisions were communicating. This combination, visual, auditory, and electronic illusion, was called multisensory deception. It was designed to overwhelm German intelligence, to confuse them so deeply that they couldn't tell real from fake. Their first major test came during Operation Brest in August 1944. The Allies were trying to capture the port city of Brest in France, and German forces were heavily fortified there. The Ghost Army was sent to simulate 2 divisions, more than 30,000 troops, to draw German attention away from the real attacks. They set up dozens of inflatable tanks, built fake encampments, and began transmitting false radio chatter. At night, the sound trucks filled the air with the noise of rolling tanks and rumbling convoys. They even drove their jeeps in loops through nearby villages to give locals and German spies the illusion of heavy troop movement. The deception worked flawlessly. German forces shifted their defenses toward the Phantom divisions, leaving other sectors vulnerable. The real Allied units advanced with less resistance, and Brest eventually fell, thanks, in part, to an army that didn't exist. But the Ghost Army's missions weren't without risk. In several operations, they were positioned frighteningly close to the front lines, sometimes within artillery range. A single discovery could have meant disaster. One German patrol once stumbled into a Ghost Army site, only to be driven off by quick-thinking soldiers pretending to be a much larger force. Their courage lay not in attacking, but in pretending to attack. They faced the same dangers as real combat troops without the protection of real weapons. Every mission demanded improvisation. They had to study the terrain, mimic the insignia of real units, and adapt their illusions to local conditions. Sometimes, they used paint to alter vehicle markings overnight. Other times, they built fake bridges or fake artillery using wooden logs and canvas. Their creativity was limitless. One soldier later said, "We could build an army faster than most men could dig a foxhole." The Ghost Army didn't just fight the enemy, they played with his mind. And the more successful they became, the more daring their missions grew. By the end of 1944, they were operating deep within liberated France, preparing for their most dangerous and decisive performances yet. Missions where thousands of real soldiers' lives would depend entirely on their ability to make nothing look like something. By late 1944, the war in Europe had reached its breaking point. The Allies were pushing east through France, closing in on Germany. But Hitler wasn't giving up. His armies were regrouping, desperate, and still dangerous. And the Ghost Army, those artists turned soldiers, were now entering the most dangerous part of their mission. Their next act would unfold in the thick forests of Ardennes during one of the bloodiest battles of World War II, the Battle of the Bulge. In December 1944, the the Germans launched a massive surprise counterattack through the snowy woods of Belgium and Luxembourg. The sudden offensive shocked the Allies. Entire divisions were cut off, and American lines were crumbling. Amid that chaos, the Ghost Army received their orders. They were to move toward the front lines to create the illusion of reinforcements where none existed. Imagine that, while most troops were retreating, the Ghost Army was moving toward the sound of gunfire, with nothing but rubber tanks, canvas trucks, and sound machines. In freezing temperatures, surrounded by snow and mud, they began to set up their illusions. By day, they hauled giant inflatable tanks through icy roads. By night, they played the thunder of engines through loudspeakers, echoing across the frozen valleys. They laid fake tire tracks in the snow, built dummy command posts, and hung fake division insignias on their vehicles. Their mission was simple but terrifying: to convince the Germans that a large American armored unit had arrived to reinforce the sector. And it worked. German scouts reported seeing dozens of tanks and convoys moving in. Their intercepted intelligence confirmed new U.S. divisions in the area. The deception bought valuable time for real Allied units to regroup and counterattack. It wasn't the last time the Ghost Army would save lives through illusion. In early 1945, they were called upon for their most ambitious deception yet, Operation Viersen, on the banks of the Rhine River. The Allies were preparing to cross into Germany, the final step toward victory. But to succeed, they needed to divert German attention from the real crossing point. The Ghost Army's job: stage a massive fake buildup north of the real invasion site. Overnight, they transformed a quiet stretch of farmland into what looked like a full-scale invasion force. Hundreds of inflatable tanks and trucks lined the fields. Sound trucks played the noises of construction and movement. Even smoke machines were used to simulate campfires and engine exhaust. Radio teams began transmitting fake signals, pretending to be the 30th and 79th Infantry Divisions. From the air and on the ground, it looked like thousands of troops were preparing to storm the Rhine. German reconnaissance confirmed it, and the deception was complete. As a result, the enemy redeployed several units to defend the fake crossing. Meanwhile, the real American forces crossed the Rhine miles away with minimal resistance. Operation Viersen was a masterpiece of illusion, one of the most successful deceptions in modern warfare. Even General Omar Bradley, one of the top Allied commanders, later admitted that the Ghost Army's trickery saved countless lives. Their actions had helped the Allies punch through the final German defenses and bring the war in Europe closer to an end. But for the men of the Ghost Army, there was no celebration. Their mission always remained secret. They packed up their inflatable tanks, coiled their sound cables, and moved on to the next deception. No medals, no parades, just the quiet satisfaction that their art had changed the course of history. As the winter turned to spring and Hitler's empire began to crumble, the Ghost Army prepared for their final performances. Missions that would take them into the heart of a collapsing Germany, where every shadow still hid danger. They had become masters of illusion, but even they could not have imagined how history would forget them for decades to come. Long before the Ghost Army became masters of deception, they were just young men, painters, sculptors, architects, designers, and dreamers. Most had never imagined they'd wear a uniform, let alone serve in one of the most secret units of World War II. But in 1943 and 1944, the U.S. Army began quietly recruiting artists for a special project. No one told them what it was. Some thought they'd be drawing maps. Others assumed they'd be painting camouflage patterns on vehicles. Instead, they were chosen to create illusions, to turn art into a weapon. The men came from everywhere. Bill Blass, a 21-year-old fashion designer from Indiana, was one of them. He would later become a legend in the fashion world, but at that time, he was sketching uniforms and pretending to be a general. Ellsworth Kelly, another member, would go on to redefine modern art, but before that, he was building inflatable tanks and painting camouflage on decoy vehicles. There was Art Kane, a young photographer who would later shoot some of the most iconic images in American culture, and Arthur Singer, who became a renowned wildlife illustrator after the war. Even Jack Macy, who later designed exhibitions for the U.S. government, was once part of the Ghost Army's creative deception. It was a strange collection of minds, people who, in peacetime, would have been sketching in studios or designing clothes, now creating illusions that fooled Hitler's armies. Their days were a mix of danger and absurdity. They could be working in freezing mud one moment and laughing about how fake their tanks looked the next. They slept in tents beside inflatable artillery, wondering if the enemy might shell them for real. They used paint to create fake shadows and tire marks, and even learned to make fake Jeep tracks using boot soles attached to wooden planks. For many of them, the contrast was surreal. War is supposed to be destruction, yet they were creating. They were turning art into survival. Their creativity wasn't just visual. It was psychological. They studied how to make soldiers believe. They understood that a shadow in the right place, a sound at the right time, and a confident movement by a fake officer could be enough to convince anyone. When the sound teams played the roaring of tanks and the engines of trucks, they had to match the timing with the visual illusions, like a live theater production with deadly stakes. They would argue about how loud to make it, how far to project it, and whether a certain rhythm of engine noise sounded more like a real convoy or a staged one. Some members wrote in their journals about the strange duality of their mission. One wrote, "We were soldiers, but we never killed anyone. We just made the enemy believe we could." Another said, "It was like painting on the world's biggest canvas, except the paint was deception and the frame was war." But the psychological pressure was enormous. They were often deployed so close to the front that artillery fire passed overhead. Sometimes, their illusions worked too well. Even Allied soldiers were tricked and wandered into Ghost Army camps, thinking they had found a real division. Despite all the secrecy and absurdity, bonds formed among them, the kind that only war can create. They supported each other through freezing nights, shared jokes while patching up punctured rubber tanks, and celebrated quietly when their illusions saved lives. Many of them sketched what they saw, not the grand battles, but the quiet moments: a soldier repairing a sound cable in the dark, an artist painting camouflage on a canvas truck, or an inflatable Sherman tank sagging in the morning sun. These drawings and paintings, hidden for decades, would later become historical treasures, real glimpses into a secret war of imagination. But through it all, they knew one thing clearly: no one would ever know who they were. Their mission was classified. Their success could never be shared. And when the war ended, they were told to keep silent. So they packed their brushes and notebooks, folded up their illusions, and went home. No medals, no headlines, only memories and the knowledge that their creativity had helped end one of history's darkest chapters. When World War II finally ended in 1945, the world erupted in celebration. Cities lit up, parades filled the streets, and soldiers returned home to the embrace of their families. But among those heroes were 1,100 men who couldn't say what they had done, not to their parents, not to their friends, not even to their wives. They were the men of the Ghost Army, and their mission was still top secret. For decades, their work remained buried under layers of classified documents. While other war heroes were decorated and honored, the Ghost Army quietly faded into history. No one knew that these artists, designers, and sound engineers had once stood on the front lines, armed with nothing but imagination. Bill Blass went on to become a world-famous fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly became one of America's most celebrated modern artists. Others became teachers, photographers, and architects. But none of them could talk about the role they played in defeating Hitler's army. They had been ordered to keep their silence, and they did for nearly 50 years. It wasn't until the 1980s that the truth began to emerge. Declassified military documents revealed the existence of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army. Historians were stunned. How could an entire unit that performed over 20 major deception missions across Europe be hidden from history for so long? Then came the interviews. Old men, now in their 60s and 70s, began to share their stories quietly, humbly, as if still unsure whether they were allowed to speak. They brought out sketchbooks filled with drawings from the front lines, inflatable tanks deflating under the morning sun, soldiers joking beside sound trucks, fake artillery guns made of canvas and wood. Each page was a window into the strangest corner of World War II, a war fought with creativity, not bullets. Documentaries were made, books were written, and finally, the world began to see who they really were. The Ghost Army wasn't just a military experiment, it was a work of art. In 2013, the US Congress officially recognized the Ghost Army's contribution. And in 2022, after nearly 8 decades, the Ghost Army was awarded the Congressional Gold Medal, one of the highest honors in the United States. It was a moment of long overdue justice. Some of the surviving members stood proudly in their old uniforms, their medals shining under the same sun that once lit the battlefields of France. They smiled, not with pride of victory, but with quiet satisfaction that the world finally knew their story. One of them said, "We didn't fire a single shot, but we saved thousands of lives. That was our victory." Today, museums across America display their sketches, photographs, and inflatable decoys, reminders that war is not just about destruction, but also about the power of creation. The Ghost Army proved something extraordinary, that imagination could be as powerful as any weapon. That art could defend freedom, and that sometimes the bravest thing you can do in war is to pretend. Their story, once hidden in silence, now echoes through history, a tribute to the artists who fooled Hitler and the ghosts who became legends.